So now that we have looked at how the richest of rich in American history earned their money, we will move our focus to how the Gilded Age affected the lives of the workers. Due to the growth of industry, the decline in agriculture and farming, and people moving into the cities, known as urbanization, the number of people working in factories increased. With booms in many different industries, like steel, textiles, meatpacking, railroads, oil, manufacturing, etc., the need for workers was immense. Factories were willing to take anyone who could perform the job, including women and children. All workers were expected to work 6 to 7 days per week, about 12 hours per day, only making about 10% per hour. That's about $1.20 per day, and between about $7 and $8.50 per week. On top of the amount of work, without the wage to back it up, these jobs were extremely dangerous for everyone, causing about 25,000 to 35,000 deaths per year and over 1 million work-related injuries. Most workers were considered unskilled workers, or laborers, because they only knew one part of a process, one that a child or woman could do, rather than the entire process learned over many years of training. This caused an increased feeling of dissatisfaction, on top of the danger and lack of pay. Workers wanted to create a way for them to fight for raises, safer working conditions, and shorter workdays. So what could they do? They formed labor unions and conducted strikes where they refused to work in order to gain leverage over their employer. Most of the time during the Gilded Age, these conflicts turned violent. During the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, beginning this period of serious industrial conflict, railroad workers went on strike after the owners of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced a pay cut for the 4th year in a row. Railroad workers went on strike across the industry. Remember that each piece of the railroad was owned by different companies. Also, workers in other industries went on strike to show support for their fellow laborers. The workers ended up attacking railroad yards, putting fire to train cars and buildings, digging up tracks. But the worst violence was in Pittsburgh, where about 5,000 workers were up against 650 federal troops. That resulted in massive property damage and 25 people killed. Military forces stopped the strike, but only after $10 million in damages. Although the railroad industry was the first to form a labor union, it was not well organized, lacked leaders, and only helped to provide insurance for themselves on local levels. The Knights of Labor was the first large national labor union and sought to organize all workers in all industries. Founded in 1869, the Knights of Labor wanted to unite workers of all races, genders, ethnicities, and occupations. They lobbied the government for an 8-hour workday and child labor restrictions, initiative and referendums, which gave voters the right to create and vote on laws, and most basically wanted a better system for negotiations between workers and management. Membership grew to about 750,000 workers. However, the Knights of Labor collapsed after the Haymarket Square riot in 1886, where a group of anarchists threw bombs during an 8-hour workday rally in Chicago. Although the bombers were not associated with the Knights, labor organizations all took a hit in the public eye after this, with most of the blame landing on the largest organization, the Knights of Labor. Another labor union that was formed during the Gilded Age was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, led by Samuel Gompers. The AFL was meant to combine individual craft unions, meaning that it wanted only to attract skilled workers, not unskilled factory workers. They also restricted their membership to only skilled white men. They focused on higher wages and shorter workdays. By 1892, it had about 250,000 members. and is still around today. With an increase in worker unrest, corporations like Carnegie Steel tried to squash the unions for good. By 1892, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had formed in Homestead, Pennsylvania, with about a quarter of the plant's workers as members. They had negotiated a raise, but it was set to expire. So Henry Frick, the man Carnegie had placed in charge while vacationing in Scotland, announced a 20% pay cut. When union leaders called for a strike, Frick shut down the plant and locked the workers out. Frick had hired the Pinkerton Army to protect the plant, but workers attacked the guards by pouring oil in the river and setting it on fire and hurling dynamite at the guards, killing 3 guards and 9 workers in the process. The Pennsylvania governor ordered the state militia to restore order. Frick brought in strikebreakers, people who took the jobs at the decreased wage, in order to stop the strike. Another strike occurred in the railroad industry less than 20 years after the first. George Pullman built rail cars at a plant outside of Chicago. Pullman created towns that his workers lived in for a rent, a much higher rent than the rest of the town. In 1894, Pullman decreased wages due to the Depression in 1893, but did not lower the rents. When some workers complained, he fired them. And on May 11th, the workers went on strike, along with workers across the railroad industry, just as in 1877. However, this strike was organized and had a leader in Eugene Debs and the American Railways Union. Debs told union workers to refuse to work on Pullman cars, but railroad managers fired anyone who followed Debs' instructions. By June, every railroad was being slowed down by the strike. The strike was broken when railroad owners brought in workers from Canada and more than 3,000 guards, and when the U.S. government declared the strike illegal because it was interfering with the delivery of the U.S. mail, and the leaders were arrested. As we learned in the web quest, the Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain to point out that below a shiny exterior, there is an ugliness underneath. Although corporations were becoming more and more successful, creating more wealth than the U.S. had ever seen, the workers were fighting for the basic rights to have a safe work environment with a livable wage. Although this fight was violent, the workers learned how to organize and unite their power to ultimately have their voices heard during the Progressive Era in the 20th century.